Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club, ladies and gentlemen. Our guest today is, of course, Treasurer Paul Keating, here to expand on his 7th budget, not counting the mini-budgets, the April and May statements, etc. But he's just written in our visitors' book that it's his 15th appearance at the National Press Club, and we're not going to argue with him because he's the man with the statistics. Anyway, he seems to be closing rapidly, I'd say, on the world record held by the man who gave him his first ministry, Gough Whitlam. So would you please welcome Paul Keating.
Well, thank you very much, Russ. It is always a pleasure to be back, as I keep on saying, that's repeating that old adage that Arthur Corwell said. He said, the secret in politics is to keep on coming back. Or the other one he said, when the caucus meets after the next election, you've got to be in it. That was another one. Now, it's pretty right. And that's why I like coming here all the time. Well, thanks once again for the opportunity. I thought I would use it today to talk briefly about some of the details which might otherwise lie buried in the, as we say, our ever-expanding budget papers. It has been a feature of the scrutiny that this government has been willing to subject itself to the amount of information we provide at budget time, which has grown both in terms of quantity and quality. The obvious drawback is that the budget statements are becoming more weighty by the year. But the advantage to you and other observers of the national economy is that there is now an enormous amount of information placed on the public record. The new innovation in this year's documents is that the forward estimates, traditionally published by myself and my colleague, the Minister for Finance, Peter Walsh, late each calendar year, have now been incorporated into the main budget documents. So they'll now be published every year for the three out years with each budget. And I stress the tradition here is a Labor one. With John Howard in the Treasurer's office, John Stone in the Secretary's office and John Hewson somewhere in between, there was no such openness. The particular element I wish to refer to today is the analysis in statement number 2, which looks at the components of gross domestic product over the past 30 years, averaged into 5-year segments. Now, I referred to this last night in the lockup, but given the fact that so many of you are in Sydney and Melbourne, you might not have really heard what I had to say. But it's a particularly revealing table highlighting the trends of a 5-year period and thereby eliminating the sharp fluctuations which so often clutter economic analysis. The story of this table is that it brings into stark relief Australia's 10 wasted years from 1974 to 1984. It is a period for which both sides of politics must wear some of the blame. Most striking of all are the statistics on business investment. The real increase of 10.8% for the 5 years to 1988-89 contrasts with the growth rates of nearly 1.6% in the 5 years to 1983-4 and 2.3% in the 5 years to 1978-79. Only by going back to the late 60s do we find rates of growth in business investment comparable to the first half-decade ended last financial year. The power behind this resurgence in investment has been the marked recovery in the profit share. From a level of 31% in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the profit share collapsed to 26% in 1982-3, but has just rebounded to be 36.7% in the financial year just ended. In other words, the profit share is now higher than the average of the 1960s and therefore I think probably higher than at any time ever, or certainly since we've been keeping the records. Of course, underpinning that recovery has been the sustained period of wage restraint which has been delivered by the Accord. This has been a remarkable commitment by the working people of Australia to better economic outcomes. There is now a wide appreciation that this benefit has not been one-sided. Employment growth in the 5 years to 1978-79 in Australia averaged a mere half of 1% per annum. In the 5 years to 1983, it crept up to a mere 1% per annum. In the 5 years to 1989, it's been a dramatically more robust 3.3% per annum. It is also telling to observe that over the latest 5 years, the weak point in our balance of payments has not been on the export front. In fact, the average real growth of 7.1% in exports has not been matched for 25 years. Rather, the weak point has been the import side, where growth has outstripped exports by more than 2% of GDP. That, of course, is a legacy of the abnormally low investment ratio of the 10 wasted years. It is a period when Australia dropped its guard. Our economic infrastructure was run down and our productive base was allowed to deteriorate. But the message of the past 5 years is that the fundamental rebalancing of the wage and profit shares in this country has underpinned a dramatic rebound in our industrial structure. Of equal importance, this re-equipment phase is finally occurring at a time when a premium is being placed on excellence and innovation. I believe there is a new sense in the community that we must be genuinely competitive if we are to make our way in the world. That is a notion that in the past was not only absent from our trade unions, but was extremely rare among our managers. The question which Australians will be asked to confront in the next 12 months is whether this administration can continue to extract the best for Australia, or the reins should be handed over to an Andrew Peacock-led opposition. What will help determine this choice will be the long-awaited release of the opposition's tax and spending policies. Though I indicate to you, as late as a few minutes ago, the leader of the National Party, Charles Blunt, says the federal opposition won't release its economic policies until the government announces the date of the next election. Well, this, of course, would be high cynicism, coalition style. What will help determine the choice, of course, will be what in fact is said. Like you, I've noted the opposition's moving target for the release of these policies, they've been saying they've been awaiting the publication of the budget. Well, with that out of the way, and with the added assistance we've provided by including the forward estimates, there is now no excuse for further delay of the next big event on the Australian political calendar. And here I also point to some figures which could assist the opposition in drawing up their costings. It is of interest that last financial year collections from the capital gains tax grew by 181 million above the budget estimate to a total of 281. Furthermore, the estimate in the budget papers for capital gains tax collections this financial year is now 500 million. That is, it went from 2550, 181, 281, 500. It's rising exponentially. In the past, the collections under the actual capital gains head of power were much more limited, and there was dispute between the government and the opposition as to what exactly would be the cost of modifying this government's capital gains tax legislation. We've largely removed this doubt by repealing 26 AAA, which taxed short-term gains under a different head of power from our 1985 reform. With that distinction removed, there's now no disputing the 500 million figure, and of course it'll be a larger figure in the following year. In actual fact, collections truly attributable to capital gains tax are probably even higher. It is beyond doubt that the existence of the capital gains tax legislation chases into the ordinary income tax revenue with its absence would be taken as free capital gains. However, in any debate on this issue, I'm happy to let that one go. That is not to include that part of the income tax system which would otherwise be in capital gains. Just deal with the 500. So we'll leave it the opposition to find spending cuts of 500 million a year to match its commitment to abolish the capital gains tax. Of course, while the opposition's rhetoric is that they would abolish the capital gains tax, they hope the fine print of their proposal will save them from finding matching savings. Opposition policy is to implement a 20% sliding scale over 5 years. In reality, it's hardly likely any taxpayer is going to sell assets and pay the Liberals' capital gains tax when the proposal implies a guaranteed 20% after-tax yield by tax deferral. The inevitable result would be a seizure in the market for assets, the kind of sclerosis we are doing everything to avoid, and capital gains tax revenue would dry up to virtually zero. The question then for Liberal tax planners, and that's putting a pretty haughty description on them, is what social security outlays they intend to nominate for cuts in order to fund this reopening of a substantial tax concession for the well-off. Similarly, the budget papers revealed that the fringe benefits tax generated $990 million in revenue last financial year and is expected to generate $1,120 million in revenue this financial year. Once again, the Coalition and its existing policy has the attractive rhetoric of a commitment to abolish Labor's fringe benefits tax, but the small print says the benefits clearly provided as a substitute for cash remuneration will be taxed in the hands of the recipient. This attempt to have a foot in both camps is unworkable. It totally ignores the complementary substantiation measures which apply the FBT to the self-employed, that is, FBT applies to companies and substantiation applies to employees, which are now generating at least $500 million a year. So that's 1,120 plus 500. So we're up to 1,650. But apart from that, by exempting benefits which are claimed to have a business rationale, it would open an enormous hole in the budget. That is to say, nothing of the implication for taxpayers of having these benefits taxed in their hands rather than the hands of the employers. Somewhat differently to our expectations, the cost of the FBT has largely been borne by business rather than shared by employees or shared with employees. And given the very large profit surge of the past 2 years, that's probably an equitable outcome. But now the opposition continues to pursue shifting the onus of payment back onto individual taxpayers. So in other words, there's now a sort of basically a 1,500 to 1,600 million tax bill which will go onto individuals if they were to pursue this change. It clearly would affect hundreds of thousands of people. It's up to them to identify who those losers will be. Of course, these two very costly proposals are not the end of what is floating around with the Liberal wish list. For a start, a relaxation of the pension assets test promised by Mr Peacock hardly sits with the tub-thumping welfare-cutting rhetoric of the Shadow Minister of Finance and the Shadow Treasurer. And of course, money spent on a more generous assets test is money that must be saved elsewhere. The opposition leaders also promised additional assistance for families and with children. This would be on top of the government's $5.5 billion tax cut and family allowance package of July, and again it must be paid for, as does the Liberals' long-awaited two-step flatter income scale. The sleeper in the opposition's tax policy is their commitment to the so-called rationalisation and reform of the existing indirect tax base. Once again, we have yet to hear whether this exercise is to be revenue neutral. But apart from all that, there's still, of course, Andrew Peacock's real lemon, his proposal to inflation adjust the tax system. Every journalist in this room knows that the idea was born of Mr Peacock's need to escape media scrutiny during his fake election campaign the week before last. And in barely 2.5 weeks of analysis, the debate has moved from the point where Andrew was being commended for a clever political gimmick to the widespread recognition that if inflation adjustment was to be implemented, it would have to be on a comprehensive basis and the massive costs would have to be worn on the budget. This is one debate that the Shadow Treasurer finds too hot. He's disappeared from sight on the issue. His 4 press statements a day have evaporated as the going gets progressively harder. All in all, a lengthy list of unanswered questions, but above all else, the opposition must provide an answer to the very basic question I'm now going to pose. In 7 years, this government has cut the Commonwealth spending, the size of Commonwealth spending by more than 6 percentage points of GDP, from 30% to 23.7%. The forward estimates published yesterday show that under existing policy, that's without any further cuts, that ratio will fall to 22% in 3 years. In other words, having already cut the size of the Commonwealth sector back to where it was 16 years ago, it is now back to subside to the levels of the 1950s. Against that background, what does the opposition have in mind when they say further cuts are needed? What kind of public sector do they want? Is their blind ideology or sheer incompetence set to destroy the social security net which has been established in Australia over 90 years? These are answers the public is entitled to. Certainly, like you, we'll be looking forward to a very comprehensive and well thought out exposition of the opposition's policy. Apart from the huge amount of information we've provided to assist them, they have all the time in the world to get it right. Well, again, thank you for this opportunity to speak to you.
Well, thanks very much, Treasurer. We now move to our usual period of question time from our media members. And I ask them, as usual, to state their name and that of their organisation. The first question is from Tom Connors.
Tom Connors from the Canberra Times, Mr Treasurer. Today's release of the July balance of payments figures give a rather disturbing current account deficit of 1.7 billion. I was wondering, in the light of this, do you not feel that the budget forecast of 18 billion for the full year is looking a little shaky in view of running high demand, high business profits, and the fact that, pardon me, that the outlook for exports is looking a little shaky at this stage? And another point I'd like to make is, in view of the fact that the market seems to be able to now absorb figures like this without getting rather panicky, do you think we've been lulled into a strange sense where we don't really worry that much about what's happening in the export scene?
Well, Tom, I think you've drawn the wrong conclusions from the figures. I say that advisedly. The seasonally adjusted number is 1477. It's well within market expectations, but it's also well within the kind of profile of the current account forecast included in last night's budget. Well within that. It's I think, consistent with the notion that, with the view that basically we'd see the first half of the year, stronger current account numbers still in the first half of the year, but the current account subsiding in the second half of the year. And the market, of course, has taken the number in its stride. Exports are up 6% seasonally adjusted, and imports are up 2% seasonally adjusted. So that trend growth in exports is there, which is what we need. And as I said in the speech, we've been seeing that trend growth now for a number of years. And that's the most important point. I mean, that trend growth is higher in the last 4 or 5 years than it's been at any time in the last 25 years. And it's there again today. But the imports are up 2% seasonally adjusted. But, you know, you've heard me say plenty of times, what arrived last month and is in this month's figures was probably generated by decisions, you know, in September last year, when domestic demand was really growing rapidly and the investment phase was in full stride. And it will take some time before those numbers start to reflect more contemporary conditions. So I'd say that last night's number, today's number, is very much within. It makes, I think, the current account forecast look very solid in that sense. About whether we're being lulled into a sense of security, I think the contrary is the case. We've been through a bout of very strong lift in the terms of trade, which has lifted demand in Australia, which has promoted, amongst, for other reasons, a very large re-equipment of the economy. And it is true that the great preponderance of these imports have been investment goods. Now, in the latter part of the phase, we're seeing consumption goods come into it, but basically it's the kind of equipment which is underpinning the change, that investment change, which that 5-year block of figures I referred to in the speech in Statement 2 itself refers to. So, you know, I think this is all part and parcel of the transition, the shift from Australia out of the Rip Van Winkle years of the sort of late 60s and 70s, where investment virtually dried up, to time where we're now actively re-equipping and restructuring the economy. And today's numbers, with that strong export number there, I think indicates that's still on. But demand is still there, and until that demand abates, we'll still see those import numbers being uncomfortably high.
Milton Cockburn, Sydney Morning Herald, Treasurer. How can your claims last night that the budget has advanced the government's social justice objectives be reconciled with the meagre $15 million to be spent on hardship mortgage relief, the cut in the first home owners scheme, and the absence of any assistance for non-pensioner renters?
Well, I think you've got housing and housing interest rates confused with social justice, Milton. Interest rates come from monetary policy, which is itself a balancing instrument, and its effects are there to achieve national outcomes in terms of the moderation of demand. And its operation is not, I think, to be put in the category of whether it fits the social justice agenda. So I just don't see mortgage relief being in the social justice agenda. But some people will face rent and mortgage difficulties which are acute, and therefore another 15 million on top of the 30 which exists. That's a 50% increase in that funding, which under the Commonwealth State Housing Agreement, which we have the states allocate on our behalf, will help people who face that dire position. But again, I think the banks are quite wise about the way they treat their customers, and generally have been extending loan periods rather than requiring the kind of problems which people would face, or those who would face who would normally look at rent and mortgage relief. The first home owner scheme, we've got a counter-cyclical policy in place to slow the non-traded goods investment down, and we don't want to be having a counter-cyclical policy with another counter-cycle in there trying to pull it up. That would be just mixed priorities.
Ian Davis.
Ian Davis from the Canberra Times. Mr. Keating, if your projections of continued moderate economic growth turn out to be correct, it wouldn't be surprising if your revenue income is even higher than the budget forecast. If by any chance the surplus does turn out to be higher than is forecast in the budget, will all that additional surplus be applied to reducing debt, as the surplus, as you said, the surplus as forecast will be applied? Or is it possible that some of that additional surplus might be applied to new spending programs before the end of the financial year?
No, the answer to that's firmly in the negative. Firmly in the negative. I don't expect that the surplus will be larger than forecast, but it was last year. It's a possibility, but it's unlikely, I think. But were that to happen, we use it all repaying debt. We've got, excuse me, the Commonwealth's debt down now, you'll see it in the budget papers, from 26% of GDP about 4 years ago to 13%. A few more years like this and there'll be no Commonwealth debt. Full stop. No Commonwealth debt. In fact, we're now at the point where the banking system is now speaking to the government about how it can manage its prime assets ratios without Commonwealth bonds, which is a pretty quirky turn of events.
Tom Burton from the Sydney Morning Herald, Mr. Treasurer. Last night you indicated that your changes in your retirement income policy would help increase domestic savings. Are you not doing what you have criticised Andrew Peacock of doing, that is using tax concessions to shift what you've called certain public savings into very uncertain private savings?
Oh, well, wrong, dear boy. Not uncertain at all. Not uncertain at all. That's the difference. Entirely certain. We've already seen a huge growth from about 20 billion to over 100 billion in superannuation assets since 1983-4. Already the success is there. We don't have to postulate some success. We can draw against the outcomes of the last few years. And were we to make superannuation more generally available, remember this, we've done it by over time repairing the excessively concessional nature of superannuation taxation. In 1983 we had a tax on lump sums, the marginal rate on 5% of the sum. So how could any government in conscience expand superannuation when it was taxed so lightly, so outrageously concessionally? And so we put a 30% tax on lump sums back then, and then entirely modified that in the tax changes of 1987, where we changed the tax treatment of superannuation to bring it into line with the tax treatment of all other forms of saving, albeit concessionally against other forms of saving, but for reasons of self-provision and retirement. Now, you can't contrast that with that hastily conceived crazed proposal we saw floating around a week and a half ago, where you'd have an enormous shock to the Australian economy, a certain loss of public savings, an enormous loss to the Australian economy, enormous shock to the Australian economy. You've got to remember this: the private sector of this country broadly funds the current account deficit. If you take the arbitrage out of borrowings, they will not fund the current account. I mean, if borrowings in this country, if we stand alone, where there is not 100% deductibility of nominal interest against the rest of the world, companies will not borrow in this country. And you'll have the Commonwealth back in the sovereign debt game of borrowing on behalf of the private sector, Latin American style. Now that's the inevitable outcome of that Peacock proposal. It redistributes tax on savings with business and government savings falling. That is, business savings, which have increased through an increase in the profit share and by dividend imputation and a lower company rate, will simply be diminished as the real tax on business is increased by allowing less than full nominal deductions. And then, of course, we've got this horrific distortion about grandfathering. Just imagine the kind of financial system and corporate system we had, where loans to date were 100% deductible, but any new loan was only deductible in real terms. That is, let's make it simple. If you had a 20% interest cost today and that was deductible, when you deduct 7% inflation, you can deduct only 13% interest cost instead of 20%. Now, what would you do with the loans? The loans which were grandfathered would become assets. Then you'd have a trafficking in assets. I mean, this is the kind of, I mean, you cannot compare that proposal with what we've got here. We've got here which is not only socially useful, but in economic terms, enormously useful in terms of savings. So, I mean, I'll have more to say about Mr. Peacock's proposal on another occasion. But I'm really waiting for Dr. Hewson to say something about it, you see. But I can't, you know, he's like the Scarlet Pimpernel when it comes to this issue.
Steve Burrell.
Steve Burrell from the Financial Review, Mr. Keating. In last night's budget, there was a pull forward of company tax of some $885 million, a pull forward of PAYE tax of some $550 million, and probably about $1 billion in provisional tax, which quite fortuitously fell from last year into this year due to delays in the tax office. Given that $2.4 billion or so, which takes us down to about $6.7 billion from 9.1, how do you respond to some critics this morning who are suggesting that a fair slab of the very large surplus is done with mirrors, and in fact the fiscal stance is, in a structural sense, not as tight as it might first appear?
Oh, well, it's not, Steve, it's not a mirror to make a discretionary decision to bring forward funds which would otherwise reside in the private sector. It's not a mirror, it's just a discretionary change. It's a policy change. And what you're saying is the underlying deficit is below $7 billion. Well, I don't think that's right, but it's certainly above 7 without the changes. It's 9 with the measures. So it's without the measures, it's something with a 7 in front of it. I might just say it makes excess economics look very excessive with their underlying surplus without measures of 11 billion. They're only 4 billion out. And let's hope they can do a better job for Mr. Peacock. But the fact of the matter is, it's a discretionary change. And look, let's be clear about the companies. They've got the highest profit share in our history. In the last year, we've paid $5 billion in tax cuts, which would otherwise have been paid in wages. So that $5 billion has come out of our pocket rather than theirs, on top of the company tax cut, which is probably a couple of billion. So just in the last year, as a result of budget decisions, the corporate sector is about $7 billion better off than it would be. This is going to take about 380 million a year permanently from that. In other words, let's say 400 out of about 7 billion, plus the profits. The profits coming from wage restraint. I mean, it's, you know, pretty unreasonable for them to complain. And so, you know, I would reject any criticism of that on that basis. And on the mirrors point, it's just simply wrong. It's a discretionary change to policy, simple as that.
Jeff Keating.
Jeff Keating, also from the Financial Review, Mr. Keating. Last night you put a 3% superannuation round on the wage negotiating table. What prospects do you see of pulling off in the next wage negotiations what you were unable to pull off in 1989? That is, a trade-off which achieves a big anti-inflationary hit on wages. And will you consider putting another round of tax cuts on the table to achieve that objective?
Well, we've not considered the next wage system at all, except other than to say that we would put superannuation on the table. And I'll just make a point in passing here. Only we can put superannuation on the table. The coalition couldn't do this. They couldn't make such an arrangement. They have no structure to make such an arrangement within. But it would be useful if we saw that continuing build-up of superannuation assets and superannuation benefits in the names of the working men and women of this country in the broad area of the ACTU affiliates, that is the great mass of the unionised workforce. But it speaks nothing about the future wage system. We'll make judgments about that at the appropriate time. We've just got the Commission handed down its decision a week ago for the current wage system. And I think let's focus on that rather than on the next wage system at this stage.
Rob Hadler.
Robert Hadler from The Australian, Mr. Keating. The Prime Minister on radio this morning was very cautious about promising an increase in living standards over this financial year. Yet the budget papers released by yourself last night indicated that real household disposable income would be increasing by 4% over the 12 months. This suggests a fairly healthy rise in living standards across the board. Is this the case that Australians can expect an across-the-board rise in living standards in 89-90?
Well, increases in household income, of course, are coming in the main from employment effects, but that gives you an impression of a household rather than individuals. I mean, as individuals, I mean, it would be, I think, difficult to be precise about where the balance of living standards might be when the wage system goes into place, etc., and the timing of those changes against the inflation rate. I mean, that's all I think I can say about it. Really.
Nikki Saba.
Mr. Keating, Nikki Saba from the Melbourne Sun. Yeah. In a different context last week you talked about putting the queue back in the rack. I was just wondering whether after the next election, if you win, whether you would leave Treasury for another portfolio.
Oh, well. I'm afraid I've got too much of an attack of the meglos to leave Treasury, Nikki. At least this is the place where you get your finger in all the pies, you see. So why would you give away a multiplicity of pies for one pie? That would just not be sensible.
Paul Kelly.
Paul Kelly from The Australian, Mr. Keating. You announced the new Industry Commission in your budget speech yesterday. Does this suggest that you'll be giving even greater priority to microeconomic reform in the future than what you've done in the past? How important is it for the government to redouble its own efforts in this area, given present levels of productivity? And finally, what's happened to John Button?
Well, nothing, as I know. He's alive and well and ready to up guards and at him at 2 o'clock. No, this is a government position where there's quite a degree of equanimity about the decision. And you asked me about do I want to do more micro reform. I started in 1983 with the float of the dollar, the removal of exchange controls, the deregulation of the financial system, changes to superannuation, changes to the tax system in 1985 and in 1987, dividend imputation. I mean, I don't know whether some of you think they're not microeconomic changes, but they are. But micro now has a smaller definition about it. It's now about ports and wharves and things like that. Well, they're important, but they're not part of the full agenda. The full agenda has been more comprehensive than that. Now, You saw on this work program we have things like energy generation and distribution, railways, passenger motor vehicles post-1992, construction costs of major plants, export franchising and distribution arrangements, raw materials pricing, product liability, available for capital from Australian industry, etc. These sorts of things, they're sort of what one may term economy-wide references rather than the more industry-specific references we had under the IAC in its heyday, which I think have probably, the need for which has largely vanished when we went to across-the-board tariff changes. When we did the 87 change of tops down to 15 and 15 and 10 to 10, that meant that the industry-specific inquiries, in a sense, passed into history, and the tariff debate broadly is behind us as we continue to lower the protective barriers on this country. So these broader references will be there. Now, the IAC will be under my portfolio, and I'll take an interest in its work program, in its activities and in its product. But I don't think anyone should assume that the Treasurer can or should attempt to overtake any of the industry ministers in their particular portfolio obligations. That's not something which is possible to do. And this is not about doing that. It's about simply getting some more data on the table to see where some of these impediments in the economy lie. And I think that'll be a very useful role for the new Industry Assistance Commission, Commission to undertake. And I might add, we've got a first-class person to be its inaugural chairman. And I think with that kind of impetus, it can be a very useful body for seeding the microeconomic debate further in this country.
Dennis Grant.
Dennis Grant, Treasurer from the Seven Network. I want to take up Nikki's point, but I'll try from a different angle. If you are to take over the keys to the lodge, there is the expectation that the people who live there know a bit more about the wide range, the whole perspective of Australian society. What is your answer to the criticism that you don't know much about defence, foreign affairs, dare I say it, social welfare?
I mean, I've just been involved in the redesign of the social welfare system for 5 years. Now, I won't use my line about under a rock, Dennis. I won't use that. But, I mean, where do you think all these family allowances change from? Family allowance supplements, changes to the common youth allowances, superannuation, the ones today, pension changes, assets tests. Where do you think they came from? Only the social... Eh? Well, defence, that was one of my early interests in Parliament. I've kept a watching brief on the defence debate over the years. Well, I keep an interest in that as well, as a matter of fact. I just came back from very informative and interesting trips in China and the Soviet Union. Just because I don't have responsibility for them, I'm not talking about them, doesn't mean to say I'm not interested in them. I am very interested in them, but again, they've been the preserve of other ministers. But I am, as well as being Treasurer, a Cabinet Minister, and that means I'm involved with all of the submissions which come to Cabinet, including submissions on foreign policy, on defence policy, defence equipment, defence procurement. But I don't need to provide you with any checklist of my interests, dear boy.
Paul Bongiorno.
Paul Bongiorno, Channel 10, Mr. Keating. With the continuing disastrous figures with the balance of payments today, the opposition says that nothing in the budget was done to really address this, and that down the track in this financial year we are looking at the distinct possibility of a recession and rising unemployment. What sort of indicators are you looking for, further to the ones that are already published, before interest rates will seriously consider the appropriate economic time for interest rates to start coming off? Aren't you running the risk of leaving that decision too late and finding yourself in recession before you know it?
Well, Paul, the opposition, of course, are the recession specialists. And only people with their particular talent could take an economy with a high terms of trade and a resources boom and turn it into negative growth, our first in 30 years. That takes a particular talent. But Howard and Stone and Hewson managed it in 1982-3. Now, a recession is when the economy actually contracts. It's not slow growth, it's when the economy gets to zero and contracts. That's what they managed in 1982-3. What we've got here is 2.75% average growth through the year, average for the year. And that's a respectable rate of growth by OECD standards. Now, through the year, and over the course of the year, it may be lower, obviously, than the 2.75 average. But we've got a very strong export forecast in those forecasts of 7% growth in exports, which means that we're going to see a switch to the, if you like, the net export sector of the economy. We're going to see net exports shifting from minus 4.4% last year to 3/4 in the year coming. In other words, as domestic demand closes down, and there'll be a switch to the external side of our production, that is to export and import competing product, and that's what will guarantee us the kind of growth rate which is a long way from a recession. They've really got to front these characters talking about recessions. When we have, well, you know, I gave you the figures today about the average employment growth, 3.3%. In the 5 years to 1983 it was just over 1, in the previous 5 years it was half. Reflecting activity in the economy. No, we'll have what we say, a slowdown. We won't be having a crash landing, but on the interest rate front, we'll make judgments about the factors in demand, and when we're convinced that we think demand is slowing sufficiently, then and only then could we responsibly reduce interest rates. But that would be the time for that to be done.
Robert Garron from The Age, Mr. Keating. Are you concerned that the Industrial Relations Commission's decision to allow lower than expected pay rises for low earners through the minimum rates adjustment mechanism could induce some unions to break out of the wages system and stymie the whole wage restructuring process?
Well, I think there's been some ambiguity in the Commission's decision, and that's, I think, being worked out by the trade unions at the moment with employer groups, and I'd prefer to see what they make of it rather than what I make of it. That's more relevant, I think.
At the moment we've got 3 more questions and 15 minutes to go. Unusually for a post-budget lunch we've got too few questions.
Well, give me a break.
So I wonder if our media members might like to include themselves in the question list. The next question is from Michelle Grant.
Well, 2 questions, Mr. Keating. Michelle Grafton from The Age. Firstly, are you concerned that too much of the investment boom has been going into unproductive areas of investment, and what more can be done to swing the balance on this? And secondly, you've naturally enough emphasised the positives in the year ahead, but I wonder what you see as the possible dangers, threats to the budget strategy, whether externally or from the wages system or whatever.
Right. Well, Michelle, if you turn up to 249 of Budget Statement 2, you'll find there quite an interesting chart, Panel B, investment levels by industry sector. And what you'll find there is non-tradable investment rising right through the period from 83 to very high level in 89. Commodities tradable, relatively flat, and non-commodities tradable picking up slowly but not as quickly as the non-tradable area, reflecting that boom, that latter boom in residential construction, non-residential construction and factories. But one can't assume that all factory production is in sort of a sense not useful on the current account, because you cannot expand your industrial base without factories. You can't put plant, you can't bed plant and equipment into place if there isn't enough raw space. And 50%, from memory, 50% of the growth in non-residential construction last year was factories. So while it's pulling up that non-tradable part, it's awfully important to the traded goods sector of the economy that those factories be built. But then you also look at the non-commodity tradables, the one we're really interested in terms of changing the structure of the place, and there's that very solid line of growth all the way from the middle of 1983. Now I saw some commentary today that was turning down. Well, it turns down somewhat relative to the pickup in office construction, hotels, resorts and factories, but it's still there. Just a ratio between the two shifts, it's still there. So that's why I think is the answer to that. But you asked me about shocks. Well, again, look, because some of you were not here yesterday, I refer you to this most important chart 8 on page 217 of statement 2. And what it shows graphically is the pickup in the terms of trade over the period from 1961, shifts in the terms of trade and shifts in demand, G&E. And every time there is a shift, every time there's a sharp shift in the terms of trade, there's a sharp shift in G&E, a sharp shift in demand. Now what that means is simply this. On the previous page, 215 of the budget paper, it says this: the terms of trade increased by over 15.5% in 1989, compared with the budget time forecast of 9%. Now when I was here, this very day, a year ago, what I was defending was the 9%, because there was some commentary around that it was too risky, we'd had too upbeat a number for the terms of trade, it was too strong. The 9 in fact was exceeded by 50%. And it was that force, that strength of the terms of trade which has given us, on that chart, that pickup in demand. And what I'd say to you now is it wouldn't have mattered whether we had interest rates at 30% through 1988. We would have got that surge in demand no matter what happened. No matter what happens. You just can't inject $10 or $12 billion of extra income into this country and not have it jumping all over the place. So that, I mean, you can say it was an error of judgment and the rest. The fact is it was unavoidable. Unavoidable. And the Treasury, at its best, can only forecast assumptions on a reasonable basis. They can look at world growth, world activity and make a judgment about the terms of trade. Their judgment was, in the eyes of most commentators, optimistic, as it turned out, and turned out to be grossly pessimistic, and that the terms of trade increase was half as much again. Now, you know, it was not their fault, but we wear responsibility for it because we're the national lightning rods in economic policy. But the fact of the matter is I don't see those sort of portents around this year. If anything, industrial growth and the growth in the industrial economies is coming off. The terms of trade are abating. We've got an abating terms of trade forecast in here. So that risk, if you like, that shock to the system through that surge of income and the surge of profits coming off the continuing wage restraint through a period of inordinately high production were part and parcel of that explosive mixture of demand last year. Well, I don't see any looming internal threats. The only threat at the moment, if you could call it a threat, is in the wage area with the pilots. And the pilots are embarking on a very foolish and risky course. Very foolish. They're very ill-advised by their organisation. And we cannot have the national wage system being torn around by a group of employees.
Please, Judge. I'll ask you too, but to follow up that last one, I'll make the point that the engineers have already got away with it. They got 17.5% last year. You might like to comment on that. Admittedly, a lot of them are outside the wage fixing system, but the figures there in the books. However, the two questions I had in mind, you've made mollifying noises about the risks of a recession. For the third month in a row, the ANZ Bank's survey of job advertisements has fallen, and they claim that that has always presaged a recession. The Department of Education, etc's figures show a fall off in their school employment vacancies. Mm-hmm. And finally, the latest employment figures, which say record employment, 21,000 of the 25,000 new jobs created in the last month surveyed were in fact part-time jobs, not well, what a lot of us would call real jobs, are you really confident that, in fact, we're not heading for a large skid on the employment figure? Finally, the second real question.
You're getting no value for money here
Sure,
today.
we've got 15 minutes, all right? We've got 15 minutes. And Russell really invited this. The Constitution, as I recall, says there shall be an interstate commission. Now, most governments in the history of the Commonwealth have been in breach of the law, as I read the Constitution. Now, however, your government has been honouring the letter of the Constitution, if not the spirit of it, by having a toothless ISC for the last few years. Now you're proposing to abolish it and have it taken over by an Industries Commission. Are you afraid that you might end up in front of the High Court for a gross breach of constitutional proprieties?
Well, that's not our advice. I can only say that's not our advice. We don't have any problems, I don't think, about that. But I know this is going to be shockingly disappointing to you, Bruce, but I've forgotten your first question.
Are you talking about the follow-up to Michelle's question, or my first real question?
Your first real one.
I think the follow-up to Michelle's, I think I've forgotten that one myself. Engineers,
you mentioned them. Now the one after that.
No, hang on. No, you haven't mentioned them. You haven't mentioned them yet. The engineers have already got under the fence and they're running loose in the paddock next door, with 17.5% pay increases this last year. So what's wrong with the pilots having a crack at the same thing, and everybody else, of course? And the other one was the fall off as measured by the ANZ, the DEET, and the fact that 21,000 out of 25,000 new jobs are in fact only part-time.
Okay, well, you mentioned the word real job. A part-time job is a real job. It's a real part-time job. But the fact is look, there's no problem about the government's employment records. 1.5 million, it's there in evidence everywhere. We don't see, we'll see some slowing in demand and some activity, but as I made clear last night in the budget speech, we've had demand running at 8%, but the total product of the economy running at 4%. In other words, you can cut 4% out of demand without touching production. You can cut, and it's production which generates activity and jobs, not demand. So, because most of what fulfills the demand, what fulfills 60% of the demand to date is imports. So you can cut demand to pieces before you touch production. But no, hang on, just a second. But the fact of the matter is, because none of us are so clever that we can actually cut demand just to the point where you touch production, we generally then cut into production. If in a slowdown, you cut into it. But that's not a recession. It's not a recession, it's a slowdown, but it's not a recession. A recession is when you get to zero and you start moving below. Now, we'll have slower growth, but not a recession. And that's the point. And whatever the ANZ's vacancies show, well, they'll show probably the same thing that happened in 1986. We did this in 1986. We affected a slowdown, but not a recession. On the pilots, what's wrong with it? What's wrong with it is when someone wants a 29% increase, which is simply just a pay grab, for that to go through the economy would lift our inflation rate into high double digits, probably with a 2 in front of it. And that just cannot be tolerated. That sort of gross behaviour cannot be tolerated. Simple as that.
The engineers across as
well? Well, I'm not sure about the engineers scene, but they might have been part of the 4%, and they might have been productivity officers. I don't know. But in terms of the pilots, they're saying nothing. We want 20. I think it's 29. Is it not 29%? That's it. Well, what government, what economic system could tolerate that?
We've got a bit of an overshooting problem now, I'm afraid. Don Wolford is the next question. We've got 2 after that, and we've only got 5 minutes to go.
Don Wolford from AAP, Treasurer. Can I come back to the balance of payments from an opposite point of view? Today's figure, seasonally adjusted, seem to imply that you'll come in nearly $1 billion under your 18.5 forecast.
That's if they obtained all through the year.
Moreover, you are forecasting a qualitative improvement
through
in the first half of 1990.
That's right.
Doesn't that mean that, in effect, you're reversing the situation of a year ago, coming in with a super conservative annual forecast in the hope that the actual outcome will look good by coming in under it?
Well, no. I mean, it's again the Treasury's best estimate in the light of all of the facts. And what you just said was that at a seasonally adjusted 1.4 billion, what you've done is multiply that by 12 and come up with 17. That means if it was 1.4 every month, we'd still be within the forecast that you were saying. But we'll be slowing in the second half of the year. That's why today's figure, when I answered Tom Connor's question, I made it clear that today's figure would be, if you like, below the kind of profile we'd have through the year. That's why that number was very much in the groove number.
We better make this the last question. I'm sorry, and it's from Peter Bowers.
Peter Bowers, freelance, Mr. Keating. I'm tempted to ask
a resident tennis expert.
Thank you, John McEnroe. I'm tempted to ask you why you prefer the German Strauss to the Austrian Strausses, but instead I'll ask you about our Wagnerian size current account. If you, Mr. Treasurer, if you take last night's budget surplus of 9.1 billion and divide it by today's current account of 1.7 billion, you find that 1 year's surplus will not cover 6 months' current account deficits. Doesn't that mean that Australia is going down the gurgler twice as fast as it's climbing out? And if that is so, how do we ever get out of the hole?
Well, Peter, we get out of the hole with investment. We get out of the hole with investment. And that's why I again refer you to page 239, as I did yesterday, the components of GDP, the thing I referred to in the speech. In the investment in the 5 years, 84 to 89, 10.8% on average. 10.8% on average. Investment in the 5 years to 83, 1.6% on average. Investment in the 5 years to 78, 2.3%. So in the previous 10 years, under Liberals, they had 2.3 for the first 5 and 1.6 for the second, and we've had 10.8. Now, that was a period when you had a mineral investment phase, a resources boom. If you take that out, in terms of the general economy, there was no investment for a decade. No investment for a decade. And if there had been no investment for a decade, and yet for these last 5 years there'd been still no investment, if Labor had not come to office and put that 10.8 into the firmament year after year for 5 years, then you could well say, how will we get out of the problem? Because I'll tell you this, old son, you wouldn't be pulling a decent salary down now from John Fairfax and Sons. There wouldn't be too many yuppies driving around their Volvos or their BMWs if we had investment running at near zero for the last 5 years. The fact that that's at 10.8 is that we finally pulled off the once in 20 years restructuring of the economy. And that's what's going to make Australia different. Now look, many among you in the last months have been countenancing the return of a coalition government, hedging your bets on the return of a coalition government. A coalition government which gave us 1.6% investment for 5 years and 2.3 before that in an investment boom which was basically promoted by the Japanese desire to consume coal to offset their oil imports from the Middle East. Nothing to do with domestic policy. In other words, adjusted for that, the investment of the previous 10 years was zero. Zero. And yet these tried and failed characters were being quietly ushered back by the Canberra Press Gallery. Quietly ushered back. Quietly ushered back. And yet here we are with the only party which has been able to turn it around to get the 10.8% a year and still have it with a profit share at record levels through a bout of demand, no wage explosion, with a surplus of $9 billion with a fourth negative growth in outlays for the first time ever, with outlays heading to early 70s levels and then to 1950s levels. You know, you say, how can we get out of the hole? I'll tell you the first way, keeping us in office. That's point one. Point one. That's point one. Because the cost of us being defeated in this country will be mammoth to Australia, absolutely mammoth. And this should weigh on the conscience of all of you members of the Australian Press Council. On the conscience. So if you want these emaciated intellectual wrecks back, if you want this stuff where the best they can do is to shove up interest rates and bring on a wage explosion in some sort of deregulatory wage nirvana of the kind Bruce is referring to, letting the pilots have a go at 29%. This is the kind of deregulation you would have. That's let them all rip. Then what you would have is all these investment share, profit share torn apart and all this investment falling. I mean, the shift is in. 5 years of this growth and investment. We've internationalised the economy. We've got a proper shift in the savings balance, an 8 percentage point reduction in the public sector borrowing requirement to deal with a 6 percentage point current account. That is, we've got an 8 percentage point fix in for a 6 percentage point problem through a shift in public saving. We've got a massive shift in the factor shares, and that's the kind of quality that you've got from us. And every budget, you always say, you know, some of you say, oh, well, the government's getting tired, it's not doing it. And then there's another great heap of reform comes out, just like last night. Just like last night. So some of you might be sick of us, like we for sure are sick of some of you. But you're going to have to put up with us for a bloody lot side longer.
Well, thank you, Treasurer. It certainly ended on a high note. We now come to a very difficult part of the proceedings. As I commented last time you were here, when you've been here 15 times and you don't like our ties anyway, well,
I have, all right.
It presents us with a problem. So you got nothing last time. That wasn't proper. So this time we've gone to a great deal of effort. And as you can see, this is Christian Dior, and it's no doubt imported. I haven't looked actually. But as you can see, it's very tony. It's a striped tie. It'll go with your striped pyjamas. And it's very tastefully inscribed the NPC here. So there you are. That's it's absolute one-off for the Treasurer. There we are.
Thank you, mate. Thank you. Thank you, Russell. It's probably Christian Dior from Brunswick, Victoria, like most of them. But they're all made. None of these Paris designers these days make anything in Paris. It's made everywhere else, and this is probably made here. So, well, it might carry.
So it's ideologically sound.
It's pure. It's okay. It means I can wear it, and thank you very much.